Ecumenical Stewardship group that brings these webinars to you, and I'm your moderator for today. I want to begin by acknowledging, I want you to think about where in the country or world you are and on what traditional land you reside. I'm speaking to you from Regina, which is on Treaty 4 territory. So the place in which I work and live and worship, and many of you as well, is the traditional homeland and gathering place of the Nipawin or Cree people, Assiniboine, Saulteaux, and Métis Nation. Acknowledging this is an act of deep respect for the peoples, their ceremonies and traditions that have enriched this land over thousands of years, and as a recognition that we are all treaty people and all relations one of another. So as I said, this is the first of our webinars, and the topic today is From Maintenance to Mission. And I'm going to say something about Iain now, who's our presenter, and then we'll have the opening prayer led by Father John, and Iain will just take over after that. So our speaker today is the Reverend Dr. Iain Luke. He's an Anglican priest and has been principal of the College of Emmanuel St Chad in Saskatoon since 2016. He's previously served as Dean of the Diocese of Athabasca and rector of St James Cathedral in Peace River, Alberta. He's also served in parishes in Humboldt, Watson, and Nipawin, and was director of the Institute for Anglican Ministry and assistant professor of theology at St. John's College in Winnipeg. So that gives you 3 provinces, and that means that Iain knows the prairies. He's been a member of the Anglican-Roman Catholic Dialogue in Canada since 2016. And his topic today is going to help us consider the factors in moving congregations to a more missional approach in their ministry. Before Iain begins, we welcome him and thank him already for being with us. Before he begins his presentation, Father John, would you open us in prayer?
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. Firstly, perhaps we can keep in mind, in our minds and our hearts, our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine right now. We continue to pray for their safety and for a peaceful resolution to the conflict in their country, and realizing that many of their sacred places at this time are in danger of destruction. So let us pray. Gracious Father, as we begin our exploration of the use of our sacred spaces and places of worship, may your Holy Spirit guide and continue to direct us in being more open and creative in the stewardship of the facilities that you have entrusted to us. Bless our speaker, Iain. We thank you for the time he's giving to share with us in becoming a more missionary, outward-reaching community of faith. Guide and bless our discussions among all of our participants today, that we may enrich one another with new insights into how we can better and more effectively be messengers of the good news, and do this with a sense of gratitude and thanksgiving. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, and it's kind of neat in an event like this when you realize that you've met a lot of the people whose names are showing up on screen, but in so many different places. And I've noticed people I've worked with here at the Saskatoon Theological Union, colleagues in ministry, both contemporary and from further in the past. Including someone who was part of the Diocese of Athabasca when I was there. And it's great to see you online here, Alan. And going all the way back to times in Saskatchewan's Youth Parliament with at least one name that I recognize here. So that's a very long time ago. But wonderful to see people from so many different places and church communities, and a great initiative on the part of the Ecumenical Stewardship Committee, and kind of a living of the reality of the Luart Covenant and our ecumenical commitments across that are very visible all across the prairies, but especially here in Saskatchewan. And that's going to be part of our consideration today, I think. I remember Bishop Tom Morgan, when he ordained me, we had a retreat where we were talking about the conditions of ministry, and he would say things like, people in rural Saskatchewan do everything together except pray together. Now, why is that? Some memorable words. But part of really the gist of what I want to communicate to you today is a different way of thinking about the church that's present, that's growing in our midst, and I hope it will be familiar to you. I hope it won't be brand new, but the question we'll be asking, I guess, is how to promote this different way of thinking about the church in our own faith communities, both local and regional, and indeed even global. So I'm going to share my screen here, and the very first screen will give you a picture, a Dave Walker cartoon church, that will ask the question about church buildings and their place and how we think about them differently. And here it is. So from maintenance to mission, my title, Dave Walker's title, Where the Church Is. So where is the church in this picture? I see skyscrapers, I see shops, I see traffic, I see a bus stop, I see a park bench, but where is the church? And of course, Dave's answer is, well, it's here, and 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 it's here, because the church is present in a way that permeates the community when we understand the church as a vehicle for, or a response to, God's mission in the world. And so somewhere in there, if you look behind one of those buildings, I bet there's a church building. But that's not the answer to the question, is it? Not the answer to the question, where is the church? It's one of the answers. And there are so many more. So that's kind of a starting off point of our picture of what it means to move from maintenance to mission in our thinking about what the church is and where it is and where it's active and where it's to be found. But it bumps up against the reality that so many of us are facing about the challenge of being a church that has a building, that owns a building, and that has to take care of that building, and may have decisions to make about that building. So if we start from that point of view, we have to ask ourselves, why do these buildings matter so much, that they've kind of taken hold of our consciousness even more than we might want, even more than we might choose, but they are a big part of our understanding of what it means to be church. And there are many dimensions to that. Some of them are healthy and fruitful. Others verge on the idolatrous, that we will do anything to keep the church open, including compromising all of our fundamental values in order just to keep the lights on and the heat going, so that we have that place to go to every Sunday. So why do we care so much about the church buildings? Well, first of all, because they are a part of our story, a part of our history, a part of our individual stories and our community stories. And I think I've certainly noticed in ministry around the prairies and in Saskatchewan especially that we're close to our history. So we're, attending a church, as I did for some time in England, that was dated to the 10th century, is a whole other kind of historical experience. It becomes a kind of a landmark, if you like, and tells you where you are and orients you in the space, the geographical space that you're in. But it's different to go to a church that your grandparents built, or that still has people in it that were present when it opened. In my time in Peace River, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of St. James becoming the cathedral. And I thought, well, that's a time scale we can take a look at. And in the children's conversation that day, I asked the children if they thought anyone was present in the church today who had been there 60 years ago when it became the cathedral. And I have to give her credit. One of my daughters put up her hand and having done a few of these children's talks before, said very tentatively, Jesus? and she got applause for that from the congregation because they could tell that I wasn't expecting that. There were, of course, two other people present that day, Marlene and Ming, who had been present 60 years ago, but sure enough, Jesus was a good answer. But in our recognizing the history, the rootedness in our own stories of the buildings that represent the church to us, I think it's important to realize how much of an attachment that creates, and a kind of an accountability too to the people who have gone before us to say, well, if they made it happen, the very least we can do is to keep it going. So there's a real desire to care about the buildings that have been entrusted to us. Of course, we care because we have an investment in these buildings as well. And to some extent, that's financial. If you've been contributing financially, you know that you want to get the bills paid, you want to keep the paint from flaking off or getting it repainted when it does. But it's much more than financial. It's a personal investment. Particularly in small communities, it matters that everybody is involved in keeping the church going as an institution, as well as a presence in the landscape. And that investment is something that's worth protecting. It's something that demonstrates our attachment to the place where we've invested of ourselves, even financially. My own theological college principal would say, money is the sacrament of seriousness. That it's a representation of the things that we are serious about. It's a fancy theological way of saying you put your money where your mouth is. And so we have that investment, and we care in the buildings that we invest ourselves into. We care about these buildings because they're home as well. I've heard enough people say the church is not a building, the church is a people, and there's an enormous truth to that. But you might as well say, a family is not a building, but buildings are important to families. The place where you live it has a huge effect on how you experience life and who you experience it with. And so the church as a home from which that people of God ventures forth and returns to, you know what they say about home, that it's where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. That's something that we can feel about our church, that it's a place that you can keep coming back to, and that you can experience a sense of belonging. And so an emotional investment, as well as everything else, is a reason why we care about these buildings. We care about the people that we know and meet and encounter on a regular basis there as well. I remember in the midst of a great church argument a few years ago, I was stirred to say, well, you know what? This is my circus and these are my monkeys. I can't say, I give up. I want to go somewhere else. Even if I want to, it's in my heart, it's that these are the people to whom I belong and who belong to me, and we belong together. And having experienced that within a community that's connected to a building and that for so much of its life knows itself in that building, creates a real attachment to the place where that happens. And of course, let's not forget God, right? Now, God, yes, absolutely is everywhere. And we learn from our encounters with God in spaces that we define as holy, that God is also to be encountered, and in all the other places that we haven't noticed the holiness of yet. But we need those spaces to teach us that. And the experiences that we have in those spaces are experiences that are so formative and so deep and so profound in our lives. I won't even say in our spiritual lives, because there's not actually a difference between those two things. That when we remember a moment that's connected to a church building, it emphasizes to us the reason why we care about those places, and that's all the way through those moments of prayer when nobody else is there with you, through to those moments when you came to seek help and found it, and the moments when you came to celebrate, and the moments when you just kind of looked around you and said, God is in this place, and I did not know it. The church buildings are also a visible sign beyond themselves of that presence. And I think those of us who are used to seeing churches from the inside underestimate this dimension. That people who pass by churches every day, who drive by them on their way to work, or who walk by them on their way to the shops, still notice them. That those buildings still make an impression, and sometimes that impression is a positive one, and sometimes it's not. I remember being in a rural parish where one of the churches had just stopped and had never really been dealt with, and there it was sitting on Main Street in the village, with the roof leaking and the paint falling off. And when I saw it, I thought, what a bad symbol that is, that the church has abandoned even its own building. How much more is it clear that it's abandoned this place? And we had to do something about that. In the end, that was a good story. We were able to restore the building and restore a congregation, so that there was active worship and an active presence there again, and spruced up the place so that it looked like the church hasn't left you. The church is still here, and a reminder to people around that space in the community that it was there for them, whether they ever attended or not. So the church as a visible sign can become really important to the church's mission and witness. And related to that, as a commitment to the place where you are, that God's presence in and among and with us is not kind of an abstract or a spiritual feeling, but is rather a commitment to be active, present, and powerful in a specific neighborhood, in a specific town or village, in a specific countryside. And that's part of the message that church buildings communicate, that they give a visible sign of, and that commitment is also lived out not simply by God, but by God's people, to say we care about this place enough to put down roots here, and to invest ourselves into the landscape here. And so the church building can be a powerful symbol of mission and witness, and connectedness to a particular place as well. So that's a whole lot of reasons why we care about church buildings, but there are ways that can go wrong, and reasons that it can go wrong. Churches are where they are. They tend to outlive the people that have built them, and perhaps generations more than that. And so there can come a time when you wonder, what is this church doing here? And is it still accomplishing those goals and achieving its potential as a symbol or a witness to God's love and presence? Well, the kinds of things that can bring that about, first of all, a change of demographics. There are so many places around the prairies where there once were towns and villages, and there are no longer, or where there once was a thriving farming community. One of the churches in my home parish was in a place where there never was a village or a hamlet. It was just a country church, and it was wonderfully attended and a center of great celebrations for many, many years. But as the population of the rural municipality depleted, so did attendance in that church, to the point where there was no longer any possibility of sustaining it. And that can be true in other ways, where the age demographics of a population can change, where in a urban setting, the movement of people and the patterns of migration and settlement in urban settings can get you to the point where I recall talking to people from a church in Auckland in New Zealand, where they were all getting geared up to say, well, we're going to figure out a way to renew our church's ministry. But once they'd actually looked around the community and studied what was happening in their neighborhood, they discovered that, it was almost entirely people of other faiths as a result of new patterns of migration. And that they weren't going to be attracting, people who had just kind of given up on Christianity or were ethnic Christians and could come to that church. And so they ended up making other decisions, which were good decisions, but it was a response to that change of demographics in their neighborhood. The change of membership, of course, these demographics can affect very specifically the congregation or the parish or the community of people associated with a church building. People will move away. People will age in place. There will be changes that affect the capacity of the church congregation to look after its building or to fill its building. That affects different people in different ways, and it's not always a negative. There can be a sudden influx of people that can require more of a church than it has in the past. And my last parish experience in Northern Alberta was one of a very rapid turnover. I used to say, we did very well. We grew our congregation by 10% every year, but then 10% of the congregation also moved out of town. And so we ended up very, very stable in terms of numbers, but the inner dynamic was very different. There was a lot of movement in and out. And so we had to run just as fast as we could just to stay still, to borrow a phrase from Lewis Carroll. There can be a change of affiliation. And by that, I mean the way in which people relate to the church. When I began in kind of public ministry, I used to say, we're now dealing with the people who have forgotten what church it is that they don't go to. And now we're a generation beyond that. So we no longer typically have in our denominational settings, especially, a kind of ready access to a pool of people that if we just scratch the surface, we'd find that there was an Anglican hiding underneath there, or a Catholic or a Presbyterian or a Lutheran or whatever it might be. In fact, we've lost touch with that possibility. But again, that happens differently in different places. We had some partnership from Peace River with churches in Newfoundland that were still much more clearly connected to the communities around them. That basically the attitude was, if you come from this community, you're Anglican. If you come from this community, you're Catholic, because that was the church in that place. And of course, then if they moved away, their affiliation was not to the Anglican Church in Grand Prairie or Fort McMurray or Peace River or wherever it was, but to the Anglican Church back home in Newfoundland, because that was their church. They belonged to that church because they belonged to that community. And so the way in which people affiliate, the way in which people connect or identify with the church changes, and you can find that creates a positive influx, but it can also mean that you don't have access to that pool of population that was there when the building was put up in the first place, or that grew over time after that. And so that creates a question about the viability or sustainability or meaning of the building. You can have a change of purpose. Why is the church there? Is it there to serve the needs of the general society because everyone is looking around for a place they can go to church on Sunday morning? Well, maybe that used to be the case, but no longer. That's not what church buildings are for, to find a place where everyone can come because everyone goes to church. Well, where will they go? Let's put up buildings so they can go. Is it there to provide a refuge for the people who still have an attachment to church in a world that has turned its face away from that? Well, maybe, but maybe we're trying to find our way beyond that sense of purpose to say, well, how do we reconnect between this perhaps now much smaller band of people who have maintained their commitment to this place and this way of life, but who still believe they have something to offer to the world around them? What role can the church building play in enabling that connection? And a change of culture. That's particularly where we are in Canada in the 21st century, the culture and its relationship to faith in public life has changed dramatically, and consequently, the relationship of the church to the world around us has changed dramatically. And our church buildings occupy a particular place in that change, where they may in fact be a lightning rod for protest or resentment against historic wrongs that the churches have been associated with. but they may equally well be places that are now passed over or that are seen as private organizations rather than public landmarks. And if you haven't noticed a theme yet in this list of reasons why we might want to ask questions about our relationship to church buildings, well, there it is. Change, change, change. Change goes on around us, and we have to keep asking the question in the light of the way we are changing, the world is changing, the relationship of the church to the world is changing, the way we communicate the good news is changing. The good news itself isn't changing, but the way we communicate it is. What does that say about our buildings and how we use them and inhabit them? And just to give you a kind of a pictorial representation of this, I like to think on the left-hand side, you have a picture of what our grandparents or great-grandparents might have thought a church was for. It was a place for the whole community to come for a celebration and to gather together, perhaps out of a rural setting where they spent most of their life quite isolated from each other and really looked forward to these times of coming together. But I wonder if our grandchildren or great-grandchildren might think of the church as more in the picture on the right, an abandoned building that will sooner or later fall down, and that makes an interesting visual picture on a country road, but that really doesn't have anything else going for it. And so that's kind of the two visions of the church right there, to say, how are we growing away from that first vision, but how are we going to make sure we don't grow into the second one? Now, there are some immediate and long-term issues that have got us to the point of asking these questions. On the immediate side, if you're at all involved in the operation of a church building or a church congregation, you'll know about these, but I'm pretty sure you'll know about them anyhow, that a lot of churches in many settings are experiencing declining resources. And by that, I mean people as well as money. And so the question is, what do we do with that? If we're no longer the space, the community that we were, how does that change our relationship to the space that we're in? It can become an increasing weight on the psyche and on the budget and on the time and energy of people who have kind of decreasing capacity to look after a building. Building issues themselves, that there's often deferred upkeep, because what's the first thing you cut out of the budget if you're having trouble? Well, it's all the preventive maintenance and the things that you wish you could do, but we don't have the money. But there are also other questions like accessibility, as both because of aging populations, but also because of increasing awareness of the need to make physical spaces open and welcoming to people of all different kinds of abilities. Location. Why is the church over there? Why is the church out in the country? Why is it off or why is it out in a neighborhood where people don't, where there isn't a population to draw from any longer? Or why is the church misaligned to the actual numbers and usage that it's getting? And then there are the decisions that have to be made sometimes, and the particular congregations face on their own timetable. Are we going to keep the building, or are we going to close it? If that decision raises its head at a certain point, you have to deal with all of these other questions. What's this building here for, and what's the rationale for keeping or closing? Do we seek historical status in order to ensure the building stays here, whether or not there's anybody in it to really call it a church or not is a whole other question. Do we merge with a congregation or congregations of another denomination or neighboring churches or parishes of our own denomination? Or do we relocate? Do we find another place to be the church in order to address these questions? And of course, in the last couple of years, we've had a whole set of extra pressures and questions arising as a result of COVID, where for many congregations, there's been a kind of enforced absence from the building or from many of the things that you're used to doing in the building, which raises questions about what's the building for, but also opens up great possibilities about how to be the church in ways that aren't as tied to historic ways of being in the building as they have in the past. Then there are long-term questions that for some congregations are building pressures to say, what's our future in this place? The problem about long-term issues is that they often don't lead to a kind of crisis point where you have to make a decision, but the pressure does build, and eventually it's possible for one of those crises to appear. But recognizing that these kind of issues are in the background. Our model of church, our definition of the church as an institution that is, that carries a lot of baggage with it, that it's always going to be there for us because someone else will make sure it is there for us. Until you realize that you're the us, that you're the people who need to make sure that it's present for yourselves and for anyone else, and you can't take that existence for granted. And so you have to go beyond that sense of the institution is out there, and it always will be. But equally, the model of the church as a provider of religious goods and services is the sort of the consumer model of the church, that people want what the church is offering and they'll pay for it if they want it, a kind of a market version of the reason for churches to exist. Again, it's connected because it's that idea that someone else is providing that religious service that I want to consume and might have to pay for. And that's really, I think, not where a lot of our churches are anymore. But there's a kind of inherited model, an inherited assumption that that's the way we work. There's a lot of local context and history that works into this as well. Where we are in the Canadian prairies, I think we're still dealing with a kind of a default assumption that this is somehow a Christian society, that at least our history has taught us that in a way, that if you build a church, there'll be people to come to it. That's why we have churches, as I said earlier, because isn't everybody looking for a place to go to church on Sunday morning? Well, if we asked that question out loud, we would laugh. We would know the answer is no. But it wasn't that long ago that the answer was yes. And that model is still working in our sort of unconscious idea of what a church does and is. And another aspect of that is this idea that we're in many parts of the prairies and the north, different denominations that handle this differently, but for a long time we've been somebody else's mission. We've been a place where another part of the church would make sure the ministry of our local church was supported because we had sparser population, remoter communities, less financial capacity. And the money came in from other places to say, well, we over here want to make sure you have clergy and church buildings and nice furnishings to go in them and all that kind of thing. Of course, that's no longer the case either, but there's still a kind of a mentality or learned habit or practice that says, if we need something, we'll have to look for who else can send that to us, rather than digging deep in ourselves and saying, what's our own capacity? And in all of those contexts, there are practices and habits that we've learned that we're just still living with because we've never changed them. And in particular, practices that are devoted to just keeping things going the way they are, keeping everything ticking over, which it will continue to do until it doesn't, right? Until it stops, until it's not possible to do that anymore. And what's the other alternative? The other alternative is to take stock at some point and say, this is not going to keep working forever. What are we being called to do differently? I just lost my share. Let's start this again. There we are. And so, yes, the fundamental question then, if we ask about a maintenance approach to the church, is to ask, what is it that we're maintaining? It sounds like a good thing in a way to maintain a church building, to maintain a congregation, to maintain a presence in a community, but what is it that we're maintaining? Does it come with all of these attitudes to say, this is how the church has been, and that's what we want to maintain? Or are we able to change our vision for the future? And that's where we start asking questions about mission. I want to offer you two stories. The photos on this page reflect one of those stories. And I think I saw Karen in the audience, so she may know St. Helens Fairview. And I think it's a wonderful story of a kind of a revolution in thinking about the presence of the church. The building on the left is the building that they sold a few years ago. And I was part of the conversations when that was happening. And of course, it was difficult to contemplate saying, what would it mean to part with a building? And in this case, part of the story was that this building was built in 1960. And if you can guess when the peak of church attendance was in the community, well, if you guessed 1960, you're right. So the church was built because we're growing. We need a new, bigger church building. And so there it was. But forever after that, it kind of stood as a kind of a mute witness to the decline of the numerical decline of the congregation. And yet at the point where people were thinking about this, they didn't have a decline in energy. There was a very strong, committed kernel of leadership. And I marked that at the meeting where they finally said, yes, we're really going to have to think about selling our building. And one of the leaders turned to the bishop right away and said, but I want it to be really clear, we're talking about closing the building, not closing the parish. And I thought, well, if you can make that distinction, you have a future. And they found a place in the strip mall on Main Street, and that's the church on the right now. And you can see it's quite a bit smaller. It's quite a bit more manageable for the number of people that are involved. And it's also quite a bit more capable of witnessing to the presence of the church in the community, because, well, where do people go on a Sunday? They don't go to church, they go to the strip mall. But lo and behold, there's the church in the place where people go. And a wonderful illustration of this, my wife reported to me after coming back from doing a midweek service there. She said, one of the ladies approached me and said, something happened the other day. I just wanted to check out with you. We were having our Bible study in here. And while we were meeting together, a man came in and he went over in the corner and he just sat quietly. And I could tell that he was really upset about something. And I went over and sat with him. And after a while, we talked a little bit. I hope I was doing the right thing. and what more could you ask to say that possibility for ministry, for connecting to the community around them, had only arisen because they had found a place to be in the middle of where the community actually lived its life in a way that the church wasn't any longer. And so I think there was a great capacity there to say, thinking about our space and where we locate ourselves is also thinking about what's the church here for. The other story I wanted to tell you was of a church that I visited in Newfoundland, where you got to appreciate it. Newfoundland communities tended to organize themselves historically around the coast because everything was focused on going out to sea, going fishing. And at that point, if you asked someone where their village was, they would say, what's on such and such a bay. But I remember a friend of mine saying in his lifetime that people had started to say, if you asked them where they were from, they would say such and such a peninsula, because roads had been built out the peninsulas, and now it was much easier to get around by road than by sea. Well, on this particular peninsula, there were 4 Anglican churches, all of which were struggling in the outports dotted around the coast. And what they decided to do was to build a brand new church building at the road crossing at the entrance to the peninsula. So everybody had to drive past that building when they came and went to do their shopping in St. John's, right? And there was this great grand new building that was an amalgamation of 4 parishes that was very visible and that was in the path of the entire population of the area, and that had a cafe inside it, so that if you were heading home from a long shopping trip, you could stop off and just get a cup of tea or coffee and visit with people. And I think they probably had problems with that during COVID time, but this was a few years before that. And it brought people together, and it created a new community of people on the peninsula, which was very responsive to what was actually happening to the demographics around them. So a couple of stories of how people can rethink their building spaces. Those both involve moving into new spaces, but I want to suggest to you ways that doesn't have to happen if it's not appropriate to a particular context. And that's what we're getting onto. But first of all, I want to say, where does the vision for orienting to something in the future come from? How do you catch that idea of saying, if we're not going to do church the way we always have, if we acknowledge that it needs to change, where does the vision for future come from? Well, first of all, God, right? The answer is always Jesus. The answer is always God. And no kidding, but ways of actually putting that into practice. First of all, to pray. I recall a colleague who shared that she had asked the church that she moved to, which was struggling, to pray consistently every week that God would send us the people we need to be the church that God is calling us to be. And she said for 18 months, nothing happened. And then people started trickling in. Someone would show up and people would get to know them. And because they'd been praying for 18 months, that God would send us the people they needed in order to be the church God was calling them to be, they actually understood that the arrival of this new person was something more than just someone showing up looking for a church they could hang their hat in. And so they started to get to know that person and to say, well, who are you? What are you bringing into our midst? And becoming more supportive of that very newness. And as more people trickled in, they were more genuinely welcoming and hospitable. But also attentive to how these people were rooted in a community in the ways that the old folks attending the church weren't. There were new ways of being connected to the community around them. And another pattern that I think is equally important is one that's practiced by a lot of Indigenous communities in the Anglican Church of Canada, and a pattern of prayer that's, I think, very familiar elsewhere, but in the Indigenous Anglican Church, it's called gospel-based discipleship, which keeps looking to Scripture and saying, what is Jesus calling us to do? And that formation in Scripture, putting the good news at the heart of who we are, and asking that question of ourselves and practicing, developing answers. When I would first ask people this question, I could see them looking back at me saying, what's Iain expecting us to say? Or what does Iain want us to say in answer to this question? What is Jesus calling us to do? Well, it's not what is Iain calling us to do, it's what is Jesus calling us to do, all of us together. And as we answer that question, using our imagination, what does our best future look like? If this church were doing everything that we would want it to do in the place we're in, with the best hope and the best aspirations and dreams that we can bring to it, what would that look like? Paying attention. What is God up to in the space where we live, and how do we join in that? Because God has left the building. I think he comes back periodically, right? But God is to be found in places other than churches, as well as at our altars and in our sanctuaries. What is God up to in the places where we live, and how, as a church, do we join in that? Those are the kind of questions that you can form discussion, study, counsel actions around, and as well as preaching, making that the heart of formation for people in a congregation. And then planning to become different one step at a time. If we know who we want to be, then we can probably figure out what's stopping us and how we get there. But no one is going to do that for us. We actually have to take that on and say, who do we want to be? What's stopping us? And how do we get there? There are some points that I think this is really getting to the meat of what I want to say to you today, that we won't answer all the questions by saying what's going on in our building or what do we do about our building. That if we're developing in other ways, we will find answers to those questions as we go. So here are some of those key points of co-development alongside asking the strategic questions about what's the building for and how does it serve our mission. First of all, as culture changes within the church, one of the things that changes is our sense of ownership. That rather than saying, the building belongs to somebody else, or the church belongs to somebody else, or the church hierarchy is the them, and we just show up and do whatever or don't do whatever they tell us to do. And this is in effective congregations, in my observation, this is one of the key questions. I recall, the number of new folks who would come into church on a Sunday, and the ones that stayed would consistently say, the thing that just blew me away was how everybody in this place has a stake in what goes on here. And I wanted to be part of that. Now, it's interesting to note that there were a few people who would show up once on a Sunday and never come back. And I think that's because they also saw the same thing, that everybody in this church has a stake in what goes on here. And I don't think I can cope with that. That's a fair answer. But if you want the church to strengthen its mission, its impact on the community around it, its capacity to share God's good news with people, in the neighborhood, you need everybody on board for that. You need people to be an us rather than standing apart from a them. Turning things upside down, recognizing that your lead members are the ones who sit in the back pew because they are the ones who get out of church fastest on a Sunday morning and start doing the things that they need to be doing in their life in the neighborhood. And so if you follow them out, what happens? What do you see? I've asked people sometimes to turn around in church and look at the doors or the windows at the back and say, well, what's beyond those parts of our structure? Because that's where our attention needs to be paid just as much as it needs to be paid to the vision of God that we learn when we're facing forward and watching an altar or a stained glass window. And equally, that means that the leadership, the clergy or the official leaders of the congregation, what are they there for? They are there to support and encourage and equip the ministries of all of the members, everyone who's going to leave that church after they've gathered and go and do what God has called them to do in the rest of their life and the rest of their neighborhood. So turning things upside down, but also turning them inside out so that we pay more attention to what's going on outside our walls than we do what's in. We at least have to learn to shift the proportions of those things. And to ensure that our attention, as much as it's wonderful to pay attention to our people, to our gathered community, the people who love us or who put up with us or tolerate us or whatever it might be when we come together, that we also have to turn the circle inside out and say, hey, everybody, when we look around us, what do we see? We're still a circle when we do that. We're still a group of people committed to a common mission. We're still a community active in the world, but even more so as we pay attention to what's on the other side of our circle. Looking for allies and expecting to find them, to say, we're not alone in the work that we choose to do when we're pursuing God's purposes in the world, because God is already ahead of us, finding people, calling them, even if they don't put it in that way, to do the work of peacemaking, of inclusion, of whatever it might be that is part of, that we identify as part of God's purpose in the world. To say there are others out there who are already doing that and who have maybe got ahead of us in that work. So to know that we're not on our own. The last church I was in, when we were recovering from a flood, we were just stunned by the number of community groups who came and said, can we help? Can we do some fundraising for you? Because we thought, who are these people? And they were people who already knew they had made common cause with us, and we had made common cause with them. We were supporting their goals and in the community because we thought God was up to something there, and they wanted to do something to recognize that. To refocus on what we have instead of what we don't have. That's a huge cultural shift when you're going through it. But to ask the questions about, what do we have at our disposal? What's our strength? What are our good experiences? What even do we have in our history? I've often asked people to think about their history in terms of a baggage allowance. It's not to say you're turning your back on the way church has been in the past, but to say if there's two things that you could take with you, what would they be? Because those are probably the two things that are your biggest strengths to bring into a new future. Whole of life spirituality, to recognize that what goes on in church and in religious activity is not something that's restricted to an hour or an hour and a half or whatever it is on a Sunday, but that it permeates people's lives. So going back to that first slide, where the church is where people are living their Christian lives throughout the community, and to know that what happens in church equips that and consequently has consequences for all of that. Prioritizing people, the number of times that, as an example, that's that story I told you about St. Helens, the church that moved into the mall, the relief that was evident on people's faces when they realized they didn't have to, spend every day of every year thinking, how are we going to fix these windows? How are we going to, if the furnace conks out, how are we ever going to get a new one in there? And the amount of time that they've been spending on that, as well as the amount of grief and agony, made me realize the cost to people and how much it was a better witness, even to our own members, to say, you don't have to be weighed down by that. God has better things for you. But again, even in a church that says we're good where we are, but we want to do some things differently, the joy, the fulfillment that comes from saying, gosh, we never knew we could make this kind of difference in our community, is something that's worth offering to people. And if you want to put all those together into one word, discipleship. A discipleship model of the church is a mission model of the church, because what did Jesus train his disciples to do? Not to hang around, but to go out. So they send them out to say, go and share the good news of God wherever God leads you, and be part of people's lives, and eat what's set in front of you, and look for the people of peace that you can join in with. These are all qualities of discipleship that Jesus taught his own followers to get out there and do. Well, how do we get there? Interpreting the world, I think, is a key skill to learn. To say, I spent some time on a library committee that was looking at the demographics of the town where I was serving. And that was insightful, because it helped me learn what the patterns that already existed in the ebb and flow of town population, but it also helped me learn that there were other people out there that were thinking about that kind of thing, and who were thinking about how to serve the community in similar ways that I and other church folk might be thinking about. So how do you get to grips with the people and the facts and the realities and the demographics and all that experience of the community that you're in? And how do you read that through a theological lens, through a faith lens? That's a skill to be learned and implemented. Recognizing that we're called to common mission. There isn't a mission of the Anglican Church and another mission of the United Church and another mission of the Catholic Church and another mission. We're long past the area of the mission of the churches, and we're now thinking about God's mission. And if there's only one God, there's only one mission. And the question for people who choose to follow Jesus is to say, how do we join in that mission, and recognize that when we're following Jesus, we're doing that alongside all kinds of other people. And so taking down the ecumenical walls that prevent or hinder that sense of discovering God's mission together and working in it together is a key step. Acknowledging that the church is local. This is a kind of I think an unusual one. There is one that you hear less about, but to say, that the church in its local existence, in the space where it interacts with a neighborhood, that's the church with a capital C. That's the church Catholic, the church universal, and the localness of the church is a mark of its Catholicity, of its universality. The church is at work in your neighborhood and in mine and in that person's and in the people that we don't knows. It's at work in all of those neighborhoods. And it's the attention to the local, the moving into the neighborhood, the tabernacling, the incarnating of God's love and presence and power, that the church bears witness to the God who sends us into all of these places. And so if you can join forces with others who are doing local, people in your community who may not be explicitly serving it from a faith perspective, people in other communities who are figuring out what it means to be in your church in a place like yours, whether that's small or big. You'll learn from each other, teach each other, but keep the focus on the local. Wise stewardship of all resources. There's work in the area of asset-based community development that Cam Harder here at the Lutheran Theological Seminary was a great advocate of, and still is. A process of taking stock and saying, what are the many different kinds of resources that we have, and how do we use them? Again, trying to take the focus away from what do we not have and put the focus on what do we have. And our COVID response is a case study in this. I think as we've moved very quickly and done extraordinary things over the last 2 years, we've realized that we had more assets than we realized, and assets that we weren't capable of seeing until they were called forth. And then formation in the gospel and by the gospel is key to this whole process. Asking yourself, how is the good news happening here and now to you and through you? And so thinking about how you do Christian formation for people in your faith community is important to building up that sense of mission, which feeds back into the question about buildings. So that takes us to the end of the presentation that I wanted to make, but I want to give you about 10 minutes to really dig into some of these questions in the way that they apply to your experience of the church. And so here are the three questions that we're going to, in a short little while, we'll get sent into breakout rooms at random, I understand. So hopefully you'll recognize a few people around you, and you may need to take a minute to introduce yourselves or to say your hellos, and to locate yourselves, to say what's where your home church and your neighborhood is. But then to share something about these three questions, and don't feel that you have to answer all the questions or that everybody has to spend a lot of time on them. Just share something in response to these. First, where do you see God at work in your neighborhood? This is asking you to turn your gaze outwards to say what's going on around you. And then secondly, what do you treasure most about your church community? When you turn your gaze back inwards and you say, what's going on in my church, and what are the things that you value about that? And then the third question, probably the key question in the end, is how do you put those two things together in the best future that you can imagine? How could the things you treasure about your church, whether you think of the people or the building or both, how could those treasures be lavished on God's work in the world as you're seeing and observing it? So those are questions to spend the next 10 minutes on in those breakout groups. And as you do that, if something comes up that you say, whoa, that's something I want other people to hear about, make a note of it. And when we come back, we'll have a little time to hear from breakout groups those highlights. And if you just want to type them into the chat, that's great. If you actually want to share them verbally, then get your hand up, raise your hand on the screen. There's a button that will help you do that, and we'll call on you. But for 10 minutes, please spend time in those breakout groups talking about those three questions, and I look forward to hearing back from you when the 10 minutes. Okay. If everyone is back here, I hope that was a good discussion and good opportunity to try and apply to your own specific settings the kind of principles and ideas that I was raising during the presentation. We have not very long, but a few minutes that I would love to hear highlights of any of those discussions that you were able to identify, where you thought, oh gosh, we should share that with more people. And you can type stuff into the chat if that's easier for you, or if you want to say something verbally, then please use the raise hand function to catch our attention, and we'll get you unmuted and able to tell us about it.
I think in our group, we found that all three of us seem to be ready for the change that you're talking about. Not only ready, but longing for it.
Wonderful to hear. Thank you. I see Harry Lafon's hand up there.
Yeah. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your presentation. I really, it's really a real, what do you call it, inspiration, I guess, to think differently. One of the things I'd like to trigger in on is that our little church on my home community in Muskeg Lake is more of a kind of an aesthetic center of who we are. It's a very pretty site, and it's very photographed for all the time. So how do we make, how do we make miles out of that in terms of keeping it alive and going? So that I think is an interesting discussion we need to have in our community.
Thank you. I see Alan Guerin's hand.
Hi, Ian.
Hi.
Long time no hear. See. I was talking in our group about how our church at Rosetown in Saskatchewan, Rosetown United, is still feeling like they are part of the community. And it took a blizzard to sort of bring that to me, in that there was a case where people were getting stranded in Rosetown. Hotels were being filled up, and there was still no place for people to go. So the people got on the phones and chats and all this kind of thing, and I got a text can we open the church up? And that was early on, actually. And then later on, it morphed into, well, they opened up the Elks Hall. But we were part of that discussion where they thought people were thinking of us as a place to go to. And I thought that was very hopeful, actually.
Yes, and this whole area is one that I think churches in urban settings actually can learn a lot from churches in rural and remote communities to say, what does it look like? What does that vision look like of being plugged into the community, not just in the religious context, but in the whole of life context? Because there are certainly rural churches that are great examples of that and always have been. There's an extra hurdle for urban churches to say, well, how do we make those connections when we haven't grown up with them, in a sense? But the vision is there.
So then I have to ask the town now, are we part of the emergency plan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Catherine Christie has her hand up.
Okay, thank you. So I was talking about, in our group, the thing that we valued about our church community among all of us was the community, the church people, the people that we were family with. So in my little community, we are the only church building. We're just in terrible, physical shape. And when the school closed down and the students started to be bused to the next community, the town bought the school and used it as a community center, doing a lot of the work that the church, used to do. When funerals happen because the crowd's too big to go in the church building, we rent the room. We have there's children's events there, particularly through COVID, that we haven't been able to do in the church building. And they have meals. They're going to start meals again now that the COVID's over. Anyway, as I thought about the deferred, what did you call them? The deferred resources? No, the deferred upkeep. Yes. And all the things that we can't do and how tired people are of it. I thought, wouldn't it be lovely to, rent a room and a cupboard in the community center and just have our services there? And it would relieve so many people. I'd have a big fight to bring that about, but anyway, it's thanks so much. This has been such a good presentation.
Thank you. And that's why I started with all those reasons why we're so attached to our buildings, because until you honor those and recognize them and see their power, you can't really engage in that conversation about do we stay here or not.
That's
because you
right.
got to know where people are coming from.
Yeah,
Denise,
the history is very
up.
much.
Denise. Unmute, please. We can't hear you.
I'm yapping away to myself. I enjoyed your presentation a lot. I'm on a special, we call it a special task force, a new committee at our church in Esteban, Lutheran Church. We are trying to figure out all of these things you talked about today. And your last thing you talked about there was asset-based community development. And we've actually, I've been working on that. I've presented it to our Chamber of Commerce and new business startup, things like that, hoping to get the community in our building. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes, because that goes wider than the church community, but the church can be a catalyst for it to say, let's all in our community think about what we have to do the things that we want to do together.
Exactly.
So
great.
Thank you. There's a few things that have been posted in the chat. Cheryl Toth says we talked about the treasure of connecting and gathering, singing and feeding, making a difference in ways that are often counter to the way our culture is. So that can be one of the gifts that the church brings to the work of God in the world. There's another comment, I can't see the name there, Janice, I think, we noticed people stepping up. We asked for help and people found ways to help. And Laura Stewart says, we thought about what is our neighborhood. Zoom has brought more people together in our worship services. Our friends have attended multiple Zoom services on a Sunday, and we treasure our small discussion group on climate change and look forward to being in a place for conversations about how we move through big changes and succeed in an energy transition. And then Alan asked about if it's recorded. So I think it's time to hand over to Cheryl for closing announcements because our time is definitely up. But I am so grateful for your participation today and the work that you're doing in your local communities and caring about that because that's where it begins as we work with others who are expecting God to be at work in the world and ready to make a difference together in our local congregations. Then that's how things change from maintenance into mission. So over to you, Cheryl.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Iain. And thank you for all of you who've put comments in the chat or brought them by voice to the conversation. People are indeed wondering. I've had several questions about, is it being recorded? Yes, it is. And where it will be. And it's going to be on the YouTube channel of the Archdiocese of Regina, as well as the YouTube channel of the Diocese of Coppell. And Nick usually puts a link in there if you can't find it. And if we'll also try to be letting people know about that. In addition, I just want to say thank you to you, Iain, for getting a very thought-provoking conversation going. And clearly people had lots of things that they wanted to be able to say in breakout groups as well. So I think it's going to reverberate. And I've just 3 questions that you brought up that are sticking with me, that maybe will with other people as we go, which is, who do we want to be? What is stopping us, and how do we get there? And I think those are just really important things to think about that help us move forward into the future. So thanks very much, Iain, for being with us today. And I'm going to give a few closing comments and announcements, and then turn it back to Father John, who is, I forgot to say earlier, a member of the Ecumenical Planning Committee and associate priest at St. Cecilia's Roman Catholic here in Regina. So 2 announcements. First one, this is the end of our first webinar. There's 3 more. I've indicated that they're being posted on the YouTube channels of the Archdiocese of Regina and the Diocese of Coppell. And so you can share those with others. They'll eventually also be on, at least I think, both communities' websites. They're on our diocesan website. And next week, our topic is greening our churches. So this is announcement number 2. Greening our churches with Norman Levesque, who's animator of Creation Care Ministry for the Diocese of Saint-Jean-Longueuil in Quebec. I think that's it. Father John, can you draw us together in a closing prayer?
Thank you, Cheryl. Gracious Creator, as you have provided us with many resources by which we can proclaim your holy name, help us to use these well in the spirit of responsible stewardship. We thank you for Dr. Iain's insights and his sharings today, and may you bless him in his ministry and his faith community and in his work in the ongoing ecumenical dialogue in which he is involved. We thank you for today, and may we further continue this dialogue under the guidance of your Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, John. See you next week, folks.